evening, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here to introduce Mark Csikszentmihalyi, whose name came up in a conversation at the beginning of this year with Professor Ammonius on the formation of the modern idea of altruism. But first, I really would like to thank Professor Ammonius, Lexi George, and Corey O'Brien, who have been profoundly supportive of this. And I'm very aware that this is a precious opportunity for me as a student to be able to be involved in helping to make this happen. So I'm very grateful for that. Professor Csikszentmihalyi is the Marjorie Mayer Eliezer Chair of International Studies and Chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also the co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. He has an AB in East Asian Languages and Civilizations from here, and a PhD in Asian Languages from Stanford. Recent books of his include Material Virtue, Ethics in the Body in Early China, and Readings in Han Chinese Thought. He is currently translating a set of Song Dynasty essays on the Zhuangzi by Li Bianzhou. He is also currently editor of the Journal of Chinese Religions and an associate editor of the Journal for the American Academy of Religion. I was struck by his writing on altruism in Chinese religion and became interested in the conversation about altruism in world religions, as perhaps a reductive category that lacks sensitivity to its local contexts, but also as a central value through which important interreligious dialogue can happen. I'm looking forward to hearing his thoughts today on the encounter between early Chinese thought and later European ideas of altruism and universal benevolence. After the talk, we'll have two respondents, Professors Michael Puett and Charles Hallisey, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Michael Puett is the Walter C. Klein Professor of Chinese History in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. He's chair of the Committee of the Study of Religion and acting director of the Asia Center. His research focuses on the interrelations between anthropology, history, religion, and philosophy. His list of publications is long and wide-ranging, but the most recent two have been Economies of Ghosts, Gods, and Goods, the history and anthropology of Chinese temple networks, and critical approaches to religion in China. Charles Hallisey is the Yehan Numada Senior Lecturer on Buddhist Literatures and current director of the Master of Theological Studies program at Harvard Divinity School. He has a number of research interests in the field of Buddhist studies, but I'd like to draw attention to one of his areas of study, which is Buddhist ethics, and he teaches a fantastic class on it, which I know because I've taken it. He's been deeply involved in the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard for many years, and previously served as director of the Religious Studies program at the University of Wisconsin. So perhaps his reflections tonight will help us to think about altruism more broadly in the study of religion. Thank you all, and please join me in welcoming Mark Csikszentmihalyi.
This does, as Nancy mentioned, come out of a kind of conversation that I had with Anne in Madison, Wisconsin a number of years ago. Somehow I ended up representing the point that I felt I had been asked to write this piece on altruism in China, that kind of piece. And the remark I made was something along the lines of, well, it's not a completely, there's kind of a genealogy there, that China does figure in the genealogy of altruism, so it's a kind of a fraught question that way. And as chance remarks sometimes have a way of doing, it caught up with me. And she said, well, I have this student who's working on altruism, and I was wondering if you could come and talk about that topic. And so I found myself trying to back up that remark, and whether it's a justifiable remark or not is you'll have your own ideas at the end of this talk, but this is my attempt to start to flesh it out. Of course, most of this then is about Europe, and I don't study Europe, so I'm sorry, but you're getting a kind of graduate school level, or not even that. I apologize to the graduate students here. So part of it that deals with Europe is going to be very sketchy. So I just want to warn you of that. But the idea is to take that assignment that I had, which was ask the question, is there altruism in China, and take a step back and think a little bit about method and genealogy. And if nothing else, that's always a good thing to do, even if it ultimately doesn't convince you. Okay, so Today I want to start with a short story and then tell a longer one. And the moral of both these stories is that things can get circular. And the short story is about the discovery of laissez-faire in early Taoist texts. In 1905, sinologist Lionel Giles commented on the historical impact of the classic Lao Tzu. He said, "The great political lesson of laissez-faire is one that the Chinese people have well assimilated and perhaps carried to excess. It may even be said to impregnate their national life more thoroughly than any doctrine of Confucius." Whether or not the impregnation of national life by the political lessons of the Lao Tzu should be considered a positive thing, Giles was followed in this assessment a decade later by the noted Chinese translator Yan Fu. Yan drew parallels between the writing of the French physiocrat François Quesnay and a passage that begins chapter 11 of the Zhuangzi describing Wu Wei, most commonly translated as non-action. Yan Fu writes, "Prior to the French Revolution, there were expert theories that made the same point that this passage does." It's a long kind of passage about the ruler who rules with Wu Wei. This can be seen in the laissez-faire and laissez-passer that the naturalists Quesnay and Gournay made their guiding principle at the time. Some 85 years after Yan Fu, on January 15, 1988, in the State of the Union address, President Ronald Reagan cited, quote, an ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who said, "Govern a great nation as you would cook a small fish, do not overdo it." Reagan used this reference to the opening lines of chapter 60 of the Lao Tzu as a summary of his own vision of America, in particular of ideas like the individual's right to reach as far and as high as his or her talents will permit, and the free market as an engine of economic progress. Things get circular is an assertion that the reason for the similarity is in part that Chinese accounts of Wu Wei were a major influence on the development of laissez-faire. The period before the French Revolution saw the rise of a view that the ideal society was one that did not chiefly rely on human laws, but instead allowed the unfettered operation of laws of nature through policies of laissez-faire et laissez-passer. Physiocrats like Quesnay and Nicolas Gabriel Clerc coined these terms as they argued that natural law was the only authentic foundation of law and social order. They used China as their primary example of a society that relied on natural law and succeeded, eschewing a complex legal system and theory of sovereignty. Quesnay wrote in his, that's it. I don't need that, do I? Just be quiet. Thank you. Quesnay wrote in his 1767 Chinese Despotism, and this Chinese despotism, he means a benevolent despotism because he's writing against Montesquieu, who accused the Chinese of having a despotism that he used in a pejorative sense. He argued Chinese were only moral because they're out of fear of punishment. So Quesnay writes an alternative view of this, in which he says, the principal object of administering a prosperous and durable government must be, just as in the Empire of China, the deep study of and continuous education in natural laws, which eminently make up the order of society. So in this book about China, Quesnay uses examples like that of the sage King Shun to describe the type of administration that leads to a durable state, noting that Shun was chosen for his moral qualities. Shun solicited criticism from the people. Shun did not interfere. Shun is also the figure, of course, in the Analects that is associated with the term Wu Wei. Clerc's A Chinese Story, let's see. Let me do Clerc first. Yeah, there. Yeah. Clerc's A Chinese Story, You the Great and Confucius of 1769 argued that the Chinese did not need to rely on positive law because they allowed reason to uncover their moral sense, which was natural in that it was inscribed on them by a deity. He writes, the supreme legislator is the supreme being. The sanction of the laws is in the moral and physical order, and nature is an expression of this order. The human heart is the code that God's finger traced in indelible characters. Every person can read it with the help of his reason. Both these books delve deeply into contemporary sources on the history of China to show how Confucius and the sage kings were able to unite nature and reason, and in so doing rely on natural law, and as a result support agriculture without interfering with it, which is a central physiocrat tenet. So, and the illustration I kind of skipped over there is actually a kind of one of the kind of physiocrat ideas that they popularized, which is based on in the Western Han Dynasty when Wendi, Emperor Wen, revived the ancient practice of symbolically using a plow at certain times during the agricultural season. And this became a major kind of trope. Here we have a kind of print of the plowing ceremony conducted by the Emperor of China. And actually a number of, there are pictures of the Dauphin doing that. And here's a picture of Emperor Joseph actually imitating this. So this kind of idea of the ideal king who plows the fields begins to catch on. So just as this idea of supporting agriculture without interfering is something they believe the king and then later the Republicans should do. Again, another Republican laissez-faire connection. The choice of invoking Quesnay to explain the Chinese origins of what Bernard Harcourt has called the messianic belief in the natural order in economics is not to make you like Chinese less. That's not my object here. I'm not saying that Wu Wei was directly translated into laissez-faire. After all, rather, I'm saying that this is a European representation of it. It was transmogrified, if anything. So the transmogrification, though, was literal enough that Giles, Yen, and even Ronald Reagan's speechwriters could see the resemblance when they discovered laissez-faire in China much later. My second example of circularity is not as direct. I will argue that as the Confucian corpus was translated and spread across China in the late 17th and 18th centuries, the awareness of the existence of another sophisticated moral system had a profound effect. This awareness of not being alone evoked a set of responses that changed not just in response to the remarkable transformations going on in Europe at the time, but it was also implicated in those transformations. The story I will tell about the reaction to knowledge of China is roughly like this. First, Jesuit missionaries initially thought that they had found a twin that they never had known existed, only later to have the Pope deny it. Two secular thinkers, though, seized on the existence of this similar-looking stranger to argue that the church wasn't unique after all, pointing to the similarities in their features as a type of proof. And some even suggested that any differences between their features were to the credit of the stranger. And finally, three, in the 19th century, a movement started their own universal church based on the notion that once we generalize the features of these two, the church and this new stranger, we will have enough knowledge to take both their places and replace them. So this very oversimplified story of the response covers a long arc of events and figures. And so I will focus on Leibniz, Silhouette, and Comte as representatives of the three stages that I'm just outlined. So at the end of the 17th century, arguments about this nature of Chinese religion were often proxies for debates about Christianity and the values of the Enlightenment. I'm going to argue that that's not all they were. But there's no question that to some extent that's what was going on. Behind these arguments, though, I would argue is kind of a question. The question is, did the Chinese have a morality? This is not the literal question that was asked at that time. Indeed, using an indefinite article in the front of morality, saying amorality, or conceptualizing it apart from religious commitments is arguably a kind of modern product of the very history that I'm talking about today. But a series of other questions that point to this were being asked in Europe. These were questions like, is the practice of sacrifice to one's ancestors idolatrous? Is Chinese the antediluvian primitive language? Was the ancient culture hero Fu Xi, who who originated the divination system of the classic of changes, really just a manifestation of the universal lawgiver known as Hermes, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Trismegistus? Is that? To people who do know more about this than I do, kind of this figurist idea here that comes out of Kirchner's Sinology, and Bruno and various people. So these are the types of questions, and in a sense, the question, did the Chinese have a morality, is kind of implicated in all of these in a certain way. So the early reception of China is usually seen through the lens of the missionary accounts. Hence, it's sometimes described as the period of Jesuit accommodation, because Jesuits like Matteo Ricci and Joachim Bouvet used the similarities they perceived between Chinese culture and Christianity as part of their conversion strategy. Their answer to the question, though, of whether the Chinese had a morality would probably be largely affirmative, as they believed in a natural theology, an early revelation of truth in China that had become largely concealed between more recent layers of the idolatries of Buddhism and Taoism. At the end of the 17th century, however, two Christian theological debates challenged this view. They concerned the questions of whether the Chinese had a word for God and whether rituals concerned with ancestral sacrifice were compatible with Christianity. In a test of the early Jesuit practice based on the reading strategy of finding precursors for Christianity in Confucian texts, the Roman Church repeatedly rejected Ricci's understanding of Chinese religion in the period from 1704 to 1742. Okay. That's a long history that I've just covered in a very shallow way. The question of a Chinese morality then begins to spin out of the realm of church debate. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, who today is best known for his contributions to mathematics, like analytic calculus and binary arithmetic, entered these debates. Together with the Jesuit Bouvet, who he corresponded with quite a bit, he argued for the early Jesuit position that there was a fundamental likeness between Chinese and Christian traditions. Leibniz often today is known for one particular argument he makes at the end of this book, Discourse on the Natural Theology of the Chinese. He says, actually, the 64 figures of the hexagrams represent a binary arithmetic, right? Like 01, 01, 01. And in fact, you can arrange them in some, in a way so that, there's, the solid line in the in the bottom would be 1 0 0 0 0 0 and then to 64. So there is a similarity to the kind of binary arithmetic which is at the basis of kind of computer programming. So he says the 64 figures represent a binary arithmetic which apparently this great legislator Fu Xi possessed. So Bouvet, who he's writing with, Bouvet is a figurist. He's part of this Hermetic tradition that believes that Fu Xi is this lawgiver that appears in different civilizations. And so it's not clear how much of that Leibniz believed in, but you can kind of see it here a little bit, and which I have rediscovered some thousands of years later. So the Chinese held on to this, but it was lost in Europe. But Leibniz discovers it, and through Bouvet, he's realized the Chinese have had access to it the whole time, which might not explain why Lenovo computers sometimes break down. But Leibniz, though, besides the binary arithmetic hexagram argument, spends a lot of time in this natural theology arguing against the kind of Chinese are idolatrous, Confucianism as idolatrous type of arguments that were being made at the time. He argued vociferously against the leading anti-accommodationist Jesuit voice, Nicholas Longobardi, In his 1716 Discourse on the Natural Theology of the Chinese, Leibniz counters its assertion that the ghosts and spirits, or guishan, are genies writing. The most ancient Chinese philosophers, and Confucius after them, have had knowledge of the true God and of the celestial spirits who serve him under the names of Shangdi and guishan. The Chinese had God and angels. They sacrificed to their ancestors as if they were spirits, but Leibniz argues that this is not incompatible with the practice of the early Christian fathers. And there's a whole background to this, a good place to see this question of, were there idolatries in the early Christian church, which is actually a kind of Protestant Catholic debate going on, is in Lynn Hunt's book about Picard and Bernard's Religious Ceremonies of the World, which comes out just a short time, just about this time. So Leibniz's syncretist impulse extends to the way that God imprints morality, which he equates with the Neo-Confucian idea of li, or principle. His discourse explains, this is the guishan, right? So we're comparing here as an image of a kind of non-human figure on a coffin from Ma Wangdui, and this is an angel that's in Versailles. But you can judge a book by its cover. I think that's the thing here. So the discourse explains when it's talking about li, he says, what we call the light of reason in man, they call commandment and law of heaven. What we call the inner satisfaction of obeying justice and our fear of acting contrary to it, all this is called by the Chinese inspiration sent by Shangdi, that is, the true God. For me, I find all this quite excellent and quite in accord with natural theology. It is pure Christianity, insofar as it renews the natural law inscribed on our hearts, except for what revelation and grace add to improve our nature. So in this stage, we're still using this idea of natural law being inscribed on our hearts by God, which is part of Catholic catechism and is this basic law. However, he's arguing for this generalization, and as we'll see, the law language begins to disappear, and we begin to replace it with an idea of passions or moral sentiments that come out of our heart. And this last part of Revelation seems to disappear. And we actually already saw that in Leclerc, who's writing 50 years later, wherein he says, and this is an elegant alteration of that catechistic notion, it is pure Christianity insofar as it renews the natural law inscribed on our hearts. This is what Leibniz is saying, except for what revelation and grace add. Yes, and note that, right? When Clerc is writing, the human heart is the code that God's finger traced in indelible characters. Every person can read it with the help of his reason. Just as Clerc said some 50 years later, a universal virtue was inscribed on the hearts of both Christians and Chinese. The importance of revelation, though, is added by Leibniz, because not to do so would have seemed impious. Okay. So this is the early stage when you're arguing about natural theology. And what happens is that this discussion, when these texts are repressed and when the Jesuit accommodationist strategy is ended within the church, the discussion moves outside of the church. And so we have this move to universal moral sentiments. After Leibniz, the background question of whether China had morality moved from the rights controversy to the issue of how virtues were inscribed on the heart. Clerc didn't add Leibniz's reference to revelation after his description of the common inscription of virtue on human hearts. And in the decades that followed the Church's suppression of Jesuit accommodation and the Sorbonne's suppression of descriptions of China by Le Comte and Le Gobien, writers increasingly located moral sentiments in the human heart without reference to God or the Church. In the period from 1739 to 1764, China appeared in other ways too. Several sets of Chinese letters were published as ways of putting social critique in the mouths of an other Chinese. When Montesquieu, who was hostile to the admiration of China, published a similar work, he called it the Persian Letters. But one of these Chinese letters was published by the French official Etienne de Silhouette, who was read by both Quesnay and Adam Smith. In his 1731 A General Outline of the Government and Morality of the Chinese in response to 3 critiques, Notice everyone that I'm talking about writes entire books on China. He describes the Chinese view of virtue as intrinsic to human beings in this way. He says, the sage has humanity as the basis of all his virtues. The love he must have for all people is not something alien to human beings, it is man himself. His nature leads him to love everyone else, and this sentiment is as natural as his love for himself. This is the characteristic that distinguishes him from all other created beings. It is the basis for all of his laws. Now, Lewis Maverick has suggested that Silhouette's description of Confucius, or this Confucian, or actually mentioned view of morality as innate, was an influence on Adam Smith's A Theory of Moral Sentiments, which appeared a few years later. Indeed, Smith's presentation of moral sentiments is very close to Silhouette's description of a view that humanity, here likely Ren, is a natural part of being human and a complement to self-interest. It's very much the kind of framework that Smith uses. In locating morality in the human heart and leaving out issues of revelation, law, doctrine, Silhouette had a bit of a model. In a general outline, he quotes Confucius's contrast between the reliability of words and that of deeds. He says, the heart of a person is what the sage explains is most suited to knowing another person, and this knowledge is acquired primarily through experience. I fancied, Confucius said, when I was young, that all people were sincere. They put into practice what they put into words, and their mouths were always in accord with their hearts. Today, however, when I listen to people, I carefully consider their actions. It is through them that I judge the truth of their speech. Actually, this appears in Analects 5:10. In fact, this is a translation or a retelling of a translation that Silhouette had access to. But 5:10 is only one of many places in the Analects where this sentiment appears. People's mouths then are not in accord with their hearts. As a result, one has to rely on the experience of watching their actions and not listening to their words. While Adam Smith is more explicit about moral action emerging from the passions rather than religion, both Silhouette and Smith identify the heart as the true seat of moral decision-making and say that decisions are the result of sentiments and not of law. Writers who were even more explicit in carving out a secular space for discussing morality include Christian Wolff and Voltaire. Drawing on Leibniz, his fellow mathematician Wolff gave a lecture at the University of Halle in 1721 where he argued in David Mangello's words, quote, Confucianism confirmed their belief that it was possible to have a morality without Christianity. Voltaire characterized Chinese religion as rational, unified, and free of superstition, in part as a way of criticizing both the common European view that morality had to derive from Christianity and the conflicts between different Christian sects. With these writers, the questions of whether the Chinese had a morality was now close to being asked and answered explicitly. They shared universal moral sentiments with Europeans, and because China was free of the church, their sentiments were more naturally expressed in society. Okay, so those are the first two stages. I also have there's an interesting thing going on also with the child crawling towards the well story. If we look at Silhouette and if we look at, Ricci's, explicitly in Ricci, perhaps in Hume, and I think very clearly some version of it is in Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. I didn't put that in the lecture because that's more speculative, but I have slides on it if anyone's interested in seeing it in question and answer. So we get to the third part, and that's altruism, the third stage in this story, which is definitely a story because A, I don't really know what happened, and B, it's done at such a level of generality. But this is Comte's Science of Altruism. Auguste Comte, 1798 to 1857, was an heir to a tradition of these writers who were mathematicians and doctors who looked at morality through the lens of their practice and were particularly eager to consume European stories about China. However, he was writing at a time when enthusiasm for China had long waned. Similar to what Quesnay had done a century earlier, though, he continued that tradition of trying to write a scientific and systematic view of the world that begins with mathematics and ended integrating morality into the human sciences. And Quesnay did very much the same thing. They both started with the mathematics of Leibniz, worked their way through the sciences, and ended with morality in their synthetic, complete accounts of the human sciences. Because Comte was writing in the 19th century, instead of simply equating Confucian and Christian moral sentiments, Comte sought to do something different. He was seeking to generalize moral sentiments, and in doing so, free them from all such traditions. This was part of the basis of a new religion, the religion of humanity, which he founded in 1849, styling himself High Priest for Humanity. Comte tried to integrate morality into biology. Now, he based his view on what he called the indisputable principle of the innateness of the fundamental dispositions, both affective and intellectual. Comte relied in part on Dr. Franz Joseph Gall's system of phrenology to show that benevolence was located in a particular part of the body. Specifically, Comte locates altruism and altruistic impulses in the anterior region of the brain, quote, where there are distinct organs for the sympathetic impulses and intellectual faculties. So Dr. Franz Joseph Gall's system of phrenology located benevolence in the middle of the frontal bone in front of the coronal suture. The 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica notes that Gall, quote, noticed a rising on the head of the highly commended servant of a friend, as well as on a benevolent schoolmate who nursed his brothers and sisters when they were ill. So he was able to generalize from those two bodies to a location for benevolence in all bodies, which is kind of the general argument that I'm talking about here in a certain way. In much the same way, Silhouette had earlier read the Chinese as locating humanity in the human heart. Comte argued that his biological view was superior to culture-bound views. The positive philosophy is the first that has ascertained the true point of view of social morality. The metaphysical theory sanctioned egoism. The theological subordinated real life to an imaginary one, while the new philosophy takes social morality as the basis of its whole system. The two former systems were so little favorable to the rise of the purely disinterested affections that they often led to a dogmatic denial of their existence, the one being addicted to scholastic subtleties, that's the metaphysical philosophy, the other to considerations of personal safety, that's the theological. Okay? So in a way, he's trying to generalize from religion and from metaphysics to come up with something that kind of transcends both. Comte is in effect claiming that his scientific approach is better than religious and philosophical views. When Leibniz discovered binary arithmetic in the Chinese classic of changes under the influence of natural theology, he had argued that the Chinese had simply discovered scientific truth earlier than he did. Comte, by contrast, states that scientific morality must supersede prior religious systems when he argues that materialists have no motive to act unselfishly and the religious only do so out of fear, echoing Montesquieu's criticism of China. Instead, since the seat of the virtues in the organs is in the organs of the body, what one has to do is adjust the body to become a moral person without fear. Positivism attracted and influenced a wide variety of philosophers of the time. In English philosopher Henry Sidgwick's Reminiscences, he succinctly explains the different role that China would play in the 19th century. So he says, what was fixed and unalterable and accepted by us all was the necessity and duty of examining the evidence for historical Christianity with strict scientific impartiality, placing ourselves as far as possible outside traditional sentiments and opinions, and endeavoring to weight the pros and cons on all theological questions as duly instructed rational beings from another planet, or let us say from China, would naturally weigh them. Okay. Whereas Chinese voices in, for example, the 18th century Chinese letters got their authority from their status as twins separated at birth, whose tradition is on a par with Europe, Sidgwick's Chinese being is useful only insofar as he or she lacks, quote, traditional sentiments and opinions. In The Invention of Altruism, Thomas Dixon explains Sidgwick's view that the only rational approach was to see moral problems from the point of view of the universe, or of someone from another planet, or from China. So Comte's positivism entailed the naturalization of a universal morality, uniting body, mind, and heart. The previous century used Confucian texts to universalize morality by locating it in a universal heart, or heart-mind, but were not willing to decontextualize it in the way that Comte was attempting to do. Okay, so this is the last part of the talk. Go back to the circularity thesis and ask the question about what does it mean when we ask, is there altruism in China? Once, not that long ago, I was asked to write about whether there was altruism in China for a volume called Altruism in the World Religions. Or no, there was no the, it was in World Religions. I wrote that the Chinese text Mengzi responded to the criticisms of the consequentialist work Mozi, which assailed the particular nature of Confucius's family-centric view of morality when it argued that universal caring, or genai, was superior. Right? So the Mozi's critique of Confucianism resulted in Mengzi's trying to ground virtue in the heart, or the heart-mind. By locating the virtues that Confucius extolled in the human heart, or heart-mind Xin, Mengzi's system was closest to altruism among the versions of Confucianism in early China. Like it's some kind of competition or race. I don't know. What was I thinking? So for example, we have this famous story of the child in the well, which Mengzi uses to illustrate the way that a person who suddenly saw an infant about to fall in a well would have his compassionate heart, his Ziyinzhishin, start to palpitate. This would not be to ingratiate himself with one's parents, nor in order to gain fame among fellow citizens, nor yet because one wanted to avoid notoriety, right? Although some people translate it as they don't like the sound of the baby falling into the well, like, ah, or something. But I think this is right. This is what the early commentators say, okay? So this is part of an extended passage where he's very explicit about locating the four duan, sprouts, germs of the virtues within the four chambers of the heart. In any case, the idea is that the virtues are innate. They're grounded in biology in some sense. Famously, this passage from the Mencius notes that whoever lacks any of the four cardinal virtues in the heart, feirenya, is not human, right? Like Silhouette says, c'est l'homme lui-même. Having the virtues in one's heart. When Jean-Baptiste du Halde introduced Mengzi to Europe in 1736 with a careful summary translation of his work, he used these words to explain this section of Mencius's text. And this is really one of the better early translations. It's a kind of a summary, but he goes through all 14 sections and goes through most of the kind of major pieces that interested him and does these nice kind of summaries of them. He says, there is no one, continued Mencius, who has not received from nature a kind of tenderness of the heart which makes them feel the misery of others. Okay. Here in du Halde's work, a text read by Voltaire and by Hume, and which predates Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments by 2 decades, is a very concise statement that sympathy is located in the heart, and that is what causes one to feel the misery d'autrui, the very word that altruism comes from. When I said Mengzi was a version of altruism, I didn't know this story, and I'm not claiming that this is the strict type of circularity that we saw in the non-action example. I just want to kind of destabilize a little bit the traditional story of these changes, these three stages that I talked about, right? It's usual to tell a version of this story in which Enlightenment values of rationality and the scientific revolution cause Europeans to unmoor morality from Christian revelation and ultimately attempt to distill it from religion altogether. The Chinese, to the extent that they're part of this story, serve as a convenient other, like savages or Persians, to contrast descriptions and prescriptions that were really a European conversation. What I've tried to show today is that awareness of the Confucian corpus led to debates about the nature of Chinese morality, which strongly influenced Leibniz, that a transmogrification of Mencius's moral innatism influenced universalist writers like Silhouette and Voltaire, and that these views, and more generally the idea that the Chinese did have a morality, was part of the background for Comte's move to generalize morality. In short, the usual version of the story is not the whole story. To be sure, for some of the writers of Chinese letters, and certainly after 1800, when Mangello shows that Europeans began to reject Chinese culture and Confucianism on a almost wholesale, China may have played the role of an other, like Henry Sidgwick's beings from another planet. There's no question that they are a foil for some people. But for others, these people who painstakingly read the Jesuit translations and wrote their own books of China as prescriptive guides for all the kings and princes and legislators that they dedicated these books to in their long prefaces filled with flattering and flowing praise. For those people, I think writing the Confucian corpus out of the developments in the 18th century can only be done by a selective amnesia born of cultural chauvinism. By grounding morality in the body, the Mencius was attempting to naturalize morality in the same way that first the Sinophile Europeans in the 18th century did, and the move to generalize morality as altruism was one end of a chain reaction to the awareness of the Mencius and of Chinese morality. Indeed, as David Mangello notes, early Chinese converts to Christianity deployed the Mencius's argument for the universality of human morality in favor of the missionary message in China. Mangello writes, Shang Huqing, writing in 1698, cited the Confucian classic Mencius, chapter 4b, to make the point that the legendary sage ruler Shun and King Wen, although originating in places over 1,000 li apart and with 1,000 years separating them, had identical standards as sages. Shang wrote that regardless of whether one's homeland is north, south, east, or west, the minds and principles of the sages are the same. Since the Mengzi saw moral dispositions as universal, when early converts wanted to translate natural theology into Chinese, they used the idiom of the Mengzi to do so. In the end, this second example of circularity is not as obvious as the first one. But I hope I have somehow convinced you that Comte's injunction to vivre pour l'autre, live for the other, was partly the result of the European awareness of a Chinese other. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Mark's talk is, of course, extraordinary in several respects. For those of you who don't know his work, you've gotten a very good sense of it. Mark is one of these people who works across several disciplines, the fields of philosophy, religion, sinology, and history. And part of what makes his work so exciting, as you could see very clearly today, is how well he pulls all of these together to make extraordinarily exciting statements. My goal here will be to ask a few questions about how you're going to pull the Altruism project together. And to do so, in a sense, what I'm going to be asking you to do is do the meta level, doing, in a sense, what you're doing here, except doing it at the next level, playing the game that Comte was trying to play, and Montesquieu and Leibniz were trying to play, dealing with the problem of what happens when you see ideas that seem very similar in very different traditions, and how do you draw them together, and in this particular case, how the implications of the way you want to do it are going to play out, at least at this early stage in the process. So, to set the stage very briefly, when one sees, of course, ideas appearing in several different traditions, there are different ways of doing it. One, of course, of handling this. One is, well, the Comtean approach. You say, well, this proves that clearly there is, if not an absolutely universal tendency toward X, at least an inherent potential in human beings to think X. And then the fact that it pops up in so many distinct traditions in presumably radically different contexts proves that point. And then the comparative work is one of playing out the implications of that. So, for example, you can say, this concept, let's take altruism as an example, we'll define it broadly enough to see attempts within numerous different societies to define morality according to, for example, inherent aspects of the human body, inherent aspects of human beings in general. And then the intriguing thing is then to say, and what are the different ways this plays out in the different traditions, and therefore comparatively, how can we expand our notion of, in this case, altruism, or how can we learn something from the implications of the different ways it plays out? And I gather that's certainly the comparative move that someone like Comte, as well as several other people, of course, that we've been looking at, wanted to do. And I gather this was more of how you were doing it in your earlier version of this project, before doing the genealogical aspect. And the second way of doing it, of course, or it's a spectrum, but the other extreme, would be one of historical connection. And so when you see something that seems very similar, it's not because it's an inherent tendency among humans, it's actually because it arose at a certain time and influenced others. And this, of course, is more of the talk we're hearing today. The argument being, to quickly recap, that some notion of what we would generally call altruism, or rather tracing back, some notion that would later lead to a modern notion of altruism, is there in the Mencius. And with the genealogy, we see how it plays out and plays such a crucial role. Now, if one wanted to take that perspective, of course, it raises lots and lots of questions. It doesn't inherently disprove the former claim. I mean, one could obviously say, well, it's an inherent tendency of human beings, and it just so happened that people in the 19th century needed the other, in this case China, and because China was big, it was a more convenient other than other cultural traditions they could have grabbed, and therefore that's why they went for China. But here, too, you seem to want to go a little further than that. You seem to want to say, no, it's not just that they were a really convenient other, which they certainly were by the 19th century. It's that there really was something there, transmogrified indeed, but really something there that significantly impacted what we have come to think of as modern thought. And indeed, it's part of a much larger package of laissez-faire, of altruism in this case, and of course, we've traced many, many other ideas coming through this exact same period. So given this new orientation in the project, it does raise several questions. First and most obviously, why would this occur? Are you claiming there are comparable sets of things going on in early China to what is going on in 18th, 19th, and now 20th century West? And what would those be? And why would it be that these ideas would suddenly find such a receptive audience at a certain time, to the point where they become a key part of the way we've come to think? And why would that be the case? And it also raises some other questions as well. If this is the case, and I might quickly add, I'm convinced by the genealogy you're giving, it also would force us to raise the following question. Given that you are someone who works so successfully across these fields, and someone who I know is also very committed to the notion that we can learn something philosophically from these Chinese texts to help us today, is that because of this historical impact? In other words, is it that we can learn so much from reading the Mengzi and other texts because, in fact, much of what we're thinking in the modern West really does come in this weird transmogrified fashion from there, and so therefore why we do a study of early China, among other things, but if we're doing it philosophically, we're actually trying to see a different nuance than the way it's played out in our current line of thinking. So we might gain a much more sophisticated understanding of altruism if we can understand the different ways it was playing out in this earlier context, in this earlier version in the genealogy, and taking us away from perhaps the dangers of a positivistic vision of altruism, because there is that historical connection. And if that's the question, then of course, and here I'll ask you to play the the religion hat again for a moment. What about those traditions that aren't part of this historical genealogy? In other words, going back to your earlier essay on altruism, would you then want to say, well, then let's look at, for example, South Asian notions and ones that did not play this genealogical role? And I won't ask the why not question, but in a sense, the why not question. In other words, what was going on there that wasn't so interesting in the 19th century? And do we have more, therefore, potentially to learn from those things that didn't make it hot because they're not as part and parcel of the way we tend to think? And is this, the goal then is to recast the altruism project in a sense by saying China was the kind of privileged piece of this, but comparatively that might get, intriguingly enough, less interesting. In other words, more interesting historically, more easily, readily available to us philosophically, but perhaps less interesting from a comparative religion perspective because it's too close, it's too connected. And then it still raises the question, well, then do you get altruism elsewhere? Because in a sense, China no longer is helpful because you do, but not necessarily for any other reason than simply because of this historical connection. So in essence, what I'm asking you is sort of the same issues that Leibniz, Montesquieu, and Comte were dealing with in terms of a methodological orientation. Given your different hats, history, philosophy, religion, how are you now putting this together in an altruism project now that this historical connection seems to be, and I'm convinced that it is, an accurate historical portrayal? In a sense, it kind of reframes the whole larger comparative project that you've been working on. So I would just love to hear more about this, more of where you're thinking the altruism project is going, how you would recast, therefore, or thinking now that you'll be recasting the larger comparative project given these historical connections. And again, for the philosopher's hat, in a weird way, does this make China too easy to use philosophically? And I hope the answer to this next question is going to be no, but and therefore perhaps less interesting because it turns out to be kind of close, too easy in a sense, and therefore not as productive as other traditions. I assume the answer to that will be no, and I certainly hope it isn't. But again, I would love to hear your overall vision of how this is going to play out now that your research has taken this new, I think very exciting, but also in a sense kind of surprising turn given what you were working on in the earlier version of it. Great, thank you so much.
Well, let me first say that Mark Csikszentmihalyi is an old friend, so it feels like old times to be able to listen to him and then to disagree with him in some ways. And so one of the things that came to my mind is a statement of Edward Said's that is that it's possible to be a nominalist and a realist at the same time. Exactly how that's so is not obvious, but it does seem to be a possibility. But in listening to Mark's version of talking about altruism in China tonight, what I think that we got was an idea that I would call nominalist. It's about ideas that are connected to other ideas that then create realities, but there's not a reality that's there beforehand. In the earlier work that Michael Pewitt has already referred to, at the end of it, Mark did acknowledge that it is possible to take up a question about altruism in China, in which one would look, taking seriously the realist option, although the way that you depicted the realist option was that it wasn't to your taste in some ways. So you described, it's possible to look at altruism in China as a historical instance. The other would be to attempt to define altruism outside of history with all the inevitable normative resources that such an effort produces. Now, for some reason, I feel that this, whatever this thing is, inevitable normative resources, there's something kind of bad about it that we know from the beginning. But this is one of the questions I have of why are we so sure, a priori, that that's bad? Now, it's also a question for us here thinking about East Asian studies, sinology, study of religion, of the paradigms of knowing that we have formed ourselves in, that were produced as part of the story that Mark is describing, in which we are participating in, contributing to academic disciplines that are dedicated to understanding human difference. So what it is about human difference that we're say, looking to see and to help to understand and to explain. But part of what we might want to ask ourselves is, what do we need to know in order to make sense of this human difference? And even if we don't know it, what we might want to allow for. The great French Indologist, Jean Philizat, one of his special virtues was that he was trained as a doctor. So that when he read Indian Ayurvedic medical texts, he could see that they were talking about diseases that were described otherwise in the kinds of medicine that he was trained in. But he had the idea that, oh, they saw this disease. They could see it too. It wasn't all the social construction of knowledge. It wasn't all cultural ideas that were kind of producing visions about things. So this is, say, the large-scale question. Now, one of the things, listening to Mark, that I had a question. Could we have a paper that would be analogous to what he gave today, that would be something about looking for self-interest in China? Would we need to have such a paper where we would say, oh, the Chinese don't have, somehow they got it from Europeans in that colonial period. Or, it's not a natural thing that human beings have self-interest. What was striking is that in the quote from Silhouette, and this is like random, kind of cultural history, is his name connected to, oh my God, like the things you learn. Something real to learn. The quotation from Silhouette, something the way that you treated him, I thought you really didn't approve of things that he was saying. But the sage has humanity as the basis of all his virtues. And the love he must have for all people is not something alien to human beings. It is man himself. His nature leads him to love everyone else. And this sentiment is as natural as his love for himself. Now, it's just a question of why the love for another. What we want to understand first is something on the nominalist way. But the love that man has for himself, we understand that in a realist way. And to say, oh, of course they have that too. That's natural. But this other thing, that's not natural. So it's just a question of how do we come to such an idea that self-interest is natural and altruism, concern for others, is not. Now here's where my good friend sounds like Richard Dawkins, in which he says, oh, you have to teach altruism because we're born selfish. And you say, oh, is this what is the ethical position that's here? That there's a natural selfishness that then it's a good thing that this idea of altruism spreads around so that we can learn it. Now, one of the things that you could say that the idea of natural law that's lurking in this is a very important position in a certain way, in which it's identifying that there might be something that is morally real, moral realism. It's just an open question then for us in the paradigms of knowing and study religion and area studies, sinology, and so on, whether our paradigms of knowing will insist that all moral ideas are irrealist, that they're not really based on something that's real there, except for self-interest, and that we don't have any room for things that are realist. In terms of acknowledging. And then if that's the case, we would be in the problem of Jean Philizat, or someone studying Indian or Chinese medicine and not knowing what diseases are, because you won't be able to recognize that, it's referring to something out there. You'll only be able to say, this idea is connected to that idea. And just a weird random event, some little mouse just ran across the snow out there, and you just say, oh, there are real animals running around out here. And
chased by the turkey out there or not?
Self-interest, right? Now, when we come to the end of a really interesting paper and a very learned one that is giving us a history of cultural connection and so on. But here's the question that just in terms of thinking about ethics, that I just want to bring back to us. So you say, in the end, this second example of circularity is not as obvious as the first, but I hope I have convinced you that Comte's injunction to live for the other was partly the result of European awareness of a Chinese other. I say, oh yes, I'm convinced. But the question is in the story you're telling, are you changing Comte's injunction into something that he just says? And so then the question is, Comte was saying, we should live for the other. When you trace this story in which you say, well, he got this kind of thing, and there's no real should in his injunction, it's just connection between ideas. Are you weakening something that's very, very important? In which you say, well, how do we get to a point where you want to, shouldn't we be able to say to someone else, you should live for others and not just be self-interested? Now, let me close with one last thing. This seems to be that we don't need to have Comte and Europe and so on to have this discussion for Chinese thinkers. I love the story of the child at the well with Mencius and so on. But he has another, someone who disagrees with him, Shunzi. And so that one of the things that you have in this is just a question on, are human beings born with some kind of goodness that Mencius was insisting on? There's something real that we want to respect and cultivate and allow to grow and to restore? Or do you need to add something else that is going to overcome these other kinds of things that are there? So that Shunzi sounds like, he agrees with Dawkins, we're born selfish. And then learning Li is what allows us to have this Ren that allows us to live for other people. So then it's a question of how it is that our own knowing, in which we trace these nominalist histories, participate, in which we, after we do that learned exercise, we once again become humans. And we say, well, how do I live for others? Should I? Should I learn from Shunzi and figure out what I have to add? Or should I say, I want to side with Mencius in this? So that's what I want to ask.
Make 3 responses, and then we can open it up for questions. Michael made 2 major points, and the first one, let me see if I can reconstruct it from these scribbled notes. Both of these were very good. They come from very different places, which I guess I probably would have predicted, but. And I have to say that doing a project like this, one feels like one is suddenly kind of like, all of a sudden lending credence to Erich von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods, because, or something like that, because so few people really work on this. I mean, there was this guy, Lewis Maverick, who was an economist who did history of economics, and he published from 1910 through 1940, and he started doing some stuff with Quesnay and stuff like this. And then there's this philosopher in South Carolina who published an article in 1960 on Hume and Chinese. And you're like, it's just these oddballs that think that there's this connection. This is like UFO theory. I don't even want to say this when And so you begin to ask this, and this is kind of my answer to your first point, is why is it that if we're going to do something besides just finding parallels, which is what I did in my first article, and actually begin to talk about influences, why is it that that's not something that people do for the most part? And honestly, I think you could deploy a lot of anthropological critiques of the concept of cultures, the tendency we have when we teach China to want to domesticate it or exoticize it, and the kind of complications that come out of that. And there was a third thing I was thinking. There was also, the way that the professions are divided to a certain extent, and the way that people train in cultural areas is also, I think, one of these things that people don't often talk about these things. I guess what I'm trying to do is not so much say, aha. In the second one, it's not so much aha, smoking gun kind of thing. It's more like kind of doing the reflection that I didn't do in the first article, to try to think a little bit about what exactly are we doing when we ask a question like, what is there altruism in China? I mean, the part of the article that I didn't write would have been like, well, what motivated us to ask that question? And what indeed, when we write a volume called Altruism in the World Religions, what work are we doing? You know, and I think that's really connected to the very question you're asking. The second point you made, why not ask about other parts of the world, is also a really good point, and a great comment actually. And really, I think if I do pursue this project at all, I think a lot about that. I think, you know, to some extent, there's a historically contingent answer, right? I mean, it has to do with, you know, the history of missions. It has to do with how natural theology came about. There were people who looked at, you know, there was a Jesuit who went to Canada and looked at the Huron Indians and, you know, made a similar argument. You know, natural theology, it's just much weaker there, you know, but there was some goodness in the noble savage. And so, you know, to that extent, it is a kind of generic thing. But I think my argument is that if you're going to do comparative religion of this kind and assume that these cultures are totally distinct at this period, without paying attention to transnational flows, and just use your vocabulary as if we're talking about totally distinct things, and do anything to do with genealogy in one culture or the other without noticing that, it's kind of a mistake. That's my position. So I think it's also so. What do you do then? Is it less interesting? For doing comparative religion then? I would argue, no, it's a different kind of thing. I mean, if you look at what J.Z. Smith does with comparative religion, he's doing it in this atmosphere where the different cultures he's talking about all share common vocabulary. You know that this word has the same root as that word. They share common histories and ancestors. And so I guess my argument is, you know, in the early period, if we want to pretend that, you know, there's not Buddhism and the Queen Mother of the West statues in Western Han, that's fine. We can do that, and we can treat them as if they're totally separate religions. But doing that for this period, we've got to be more like J.Z. Smith to a certain extent. I mean, so I think that would be the implication. I don't think that's less interesting. It's just a different game. And Charlie, yeah, you caught me. I'm a social constructivist. My father was a social constructivist. I couldn't help it. It was I was determined by that. Just like Lacombe, I have no agency whatsoever. And
I guess you're walking home then, right?
yeah. So no. And in this paper, I'm telling stories without worrying about many of the things you're talking about the anxiety of influence, about Comte's agency, you know, and if indeed we wanted to tell a more realist story, you know, if we wanted Vittorio De Sica to do the film version of this talk, what we would do is we would pay attention to agency and we would begin to talk about this very question. And in a way, I would be more, not just because I like De Sica, but I would be more interested in that version of the talk than the one that's being filmed here. You know, why is it bad to consider altruism as outside of history? And I don't think it's bad. I think we could reframe this talk in those terms. And then we would see all these scholars talking about Chinese concepts in those other languages as answering questions like, was there Christian virtue in China? Is there altruism in China? Because in a sense, that's what Du Halde and Silhouette are doing, is writing articles for Neusner volumes, because they're trying to match these things up in the same way. So, and I guess the one place I disagree is that leaving out self-interest isn't necessarily assuming that in this shallow framing that I'm doing, leaving out self-interest isn't necessarily assuming it's a natural thing. It's more perhaps arguably it's just not part of this circular feedback loop that I'm talking about. For whatever reason, the Jesuits didn't bring Xunzi back to nearly to the extent they did the Mencian side. And so, for whatever reason, that it was in conflict with the version of sin, or because it's not part of that. In the account of Hume's and Smith, when they make this same balance of self-interest against good things, they're to some extent accepting this notion that self-interest is natural, because in a way they want to justify it. But I think that version of theirs comes more out of the kind of naturalization of sin into their picture of human sentiments, which isn't part of the Chinese picture. So it's a very good comment, and I appreciate it, and I'll come up with a better answer next time we talk. But so in any case, thank you both for those comments. I found them very helpful. And do people have questions? I know there are a bunch of people who have a class now at 6:30, so I know they have to run. So those people that don't, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them.
Yes.
Obviously, have discussed the French looking at the Chinese Confucian system, writing a great deal about it. Have any of the Chinese ever looked at these kinds of interpretations and the use of their philosophical religious system and done similar work?
You mean pre-modern or today?
Can you give him?
No, either contemporary with the period you're looking at or today.
Yeah, there is, and it's really interesting actually, because like there's a book by a Korean author named Park, who does a version of this, but it's very interesting the different way it's presented from, say, Maverick or some of these other people who attempt to do this same project on the other side. And it's really much more kind of about kind of history of Western nationalism, and how that, at least that's how he frames it. So he's looking at these different authors and how they appropriate these notions, and saying, the reason that, and when he looks at Montesquieu in particular, he says, Montesquieu alone among all these people has these negative things to say about China. And so it is kind of an interesting kind of alternative point of view for doing that history. So in the modern period that happens. I think that's an interesting thing. I think, in the 19th century, there were all these movements to find, in China, to find analogs to things like evolution in Taoist thought, for example, was a big one, and Husserl and all. There are these things, and so I'm interested in the question of, maybe part of the reason this genealogical question wasn't asked so much was that the more important question was to find analogs to these things in the Chinese tradition. And so, again, I think there might be some kind of structural disincentive to begin to talk about it's much better to show this was independently arrived at by the discussion of, Wu Hua in the Zhuangzi. That was early evolution, perhaps. I don't know. It's a very good question. I'm just kind of winging it on the answer, but I probably would have a better answer if you email me later or something.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It's really elucidating genealogy. But I feel like I came to the wrong talk. I felt I came to... So the talk was named Finding Altruism in China.
Yeah.
And I think you answered the question, Finding China in Altruism. But now that we have that sort of qualified really well, what are the implications for that former question? Would you, I believe you wrote a paper earlier, right. Fairly straightforward, it sounds like. Mm-hmm. How would you write that paper differently, given this new qualified notion of altruism?
That's a really good question. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that to to a certain extent, given the frame of the book that was being put together, I'd kind of be comfortable writing that same paper to some extent, right? If we adopt what Charlie is saying, is that the notion, the idea that we can talk about something called altruism kind of outside of history in some sense, which is what Neusner did. Is that kind of what you felt that volume was doing? Or?
No, I was just quoting you.
Okay.
So
But
I haven't looked at the rest of the volume. I haven't looked at your reply.
I think that that's a reasonable type of job to do, but I do feel like if I were to write an article I want to write about it, I would kind of try to problematize that whole question and say, kind of what's going on here to a certain extent. I mean, to me, it's more interesting to talk about the strategy, compare the strategy that Mencius is taking to respond to the type of universalist move that Moza is making, and compare that to kind of what's going on in Europe at the same time, and then say, maybe that's why Mencius becomes so important to the Europeans, because they're seeking a script to do some of the same things. And so to me, that would be a more interesting way of framing it. But that's, I'm not sure. As to the title of the talk, in a way, if you accept the thesis that these cultures are interwoven in a certain way, then what these people were doing is finding Christian virtue in China, finding altruism in China. And so I guess that would be my defense on that particular title. I'm sorry for the false advertising. If you email me, I'll send you the original article, which is what you were looking for.
You mentioned that the Jesuits hadn't been translating Shunzi, or interested in Shunzi. To what degree is that because they wanted their audience to think that there was one solid, good Confucian point of view and didn't want to complicate things?
That's a really good question. So the question is then whether Shunzi would fit in the same category as Buddhism and Taoism in some way, as antithetical to the tradition that was inspired by Fuxi, or the tradition that's part of the natural theology question. And to what extent is he just or is it, as in your account, that they wanted to present it as a unified kind of picture? And I don't know that. That's an interesting question. One of the things like Du Halde is all about Confucianism, except he does talk about Zhuangzi, but he doesn't talk about Xunzi. So that's kind of strange. So I noticed that, but I haven't really tracked it down in the way you're asking. I think, that made me think of something else about, Voltaire, for example, and the syncretists, and Leibniz is a syncretist. They are, to some extent, and Voltaire explicitly does this, he says the Chinese are unified in their religion, unlike Europe. And so he's using it also, he's also deploying it for that purpose. And in which case I think your question would really maybe be getting onto something, because it's saying, to the extent that they're eliminating the idea that there's a multivocal Confucian tradition, to the extent that it's univocal, it's useful in advocating a model for a syncretist kind of approach. Well, no, I mean, we as a field, it's definitely something that you have to fight against if you're going to give an alternative picture, especially in intro classes.
Yeah, Mark, thanks very much. I'm not sure, I have a couple of amorphous questions here, but one of them was just when you do genealogy, obviously a lot goes into the choices of how you trace that genealogy and connect the dots. And it seemed to me here we had a lot of the French, maybe a German thrown in, but there's a whole other discourse going on among the British at this time, which if one integrates them into the story, I'm wondering how that might change the narrative that you've told here, or the genealogy that you've told. For example, Legge doesn't appear in your account here, but who's dealt with some of these things too. So is there another sort of British side of things that would factor into this? Because you've got a clear anti-Catholic bias that's going on, other things that are going on there. And this is precisely when we have people in Europe just drunk on Buddhist ideas as well, that are impacting this from an oblique angle, it seems to me. So this idea of sort of separating off just the Confucian story maybe is a little framing it in a particular way that may not capture some of that complexity. But I'm just curious about how, if one looks around a little bit further, how that impacts it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And if you really wanted to do this, you'd have to pay attention to, I mean, in the 18th century, arguably, French was the language. And so when Hume is writing, it's pretty clear to me that he's reading Du Halde in French because it appears in French before his book comes out that's using some of this stuff. Before the English translation comes out a few years later. So I feel like as long as we're talking about the 18th century, many of the English intellectuals are consuming these French writers. By the 19th century, I think you begin to get a much more complex picture. And Legge, who's kind of a little bit, we're talking about around Comte, a little after Comte, is an incredibly important figure. But in a way, I had three stages to the story. And honestly, Legge is in some sense rehearsing or kind of the first stage again. He's really trying to wrestle with the parallels but the absence of revelation. If you read his prolegomena to the translation of the Mencius, he starts out, he's got that schizophrenic Jesuit argument, the one between kind of the figurists and the Riccians and Longobardi about the rights controversy, and he's like, the beginning of that prolegomena, he's Riccian. He's like, Mencius is my best friend. He's just like Bishop Butler. That's why I'm translating Ren as Benevolence. And he's as far, he's as close to Christian truth as anyone. And then the second part, he kind of catches himself and he says, but of course, he doesn't think about what happens after you die. And he doesn't, by not talking about revelation and hell, he made the Chinese an easy target for the Buddhist and Taoist idolatry. And so in a way, it's a fascinating document. And so in a way, I think that's the Legge story is the missionary story to some extent, that first stage.
But that's what's so interesting. It seems to me the missionary story gets flipped in a really weird way in China when you have a contradictory argument going on when they encounter Buddhist ideas of, say, universal salvation and also for Taoists, Lingbao Taoists and Buddhists, they hated that stuff. They wanted, if somebody sinned, they wanted that person to suffer the repercussions of that, and you couldn't just sort of, all of those liturgies that I say, you're absolved and I'm going to resist. 7 ancestors back are also saved and everybody come along kind of a thing. And they hated that. They wanted responsibility for that, which seems to complicate there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I don't really know. I mean, I think like the move, it's funny because Quesnay in the 18th century, writing in France, loves non-action. He loves the laissez-faire stuff. But he associates it with the Confucianism. When he talks about Taoism, it's idolatry. And he's really pejorative about it. I mean, really. But then by the 19th century, when Herbert Giles does the first translation of Zhuangzi into English, in his preface, he says that, well, really, it was Lao Tzu who was spiritual, and it was Confucius who came along and tried to make the Chinese materialistic, and then Zhuangzi, realized that Lao Tzu's truths were being stepped on and tried to revive these. And so the narrative's flipped to a certain extent. All of a sudden, Taoism for Giles is the one that's closest to truth in some way, and Confucianism is the thing to avoid. So it's interesting. You're right. England is a different case in a lot of ways. That's fascinating. So yeah.
Do you have a very quick last question? If not,
Can I ask a question?
quick.
I'm still unclear. Do you think that altruism exists, or there's only ideas of altruism?
I think altruism exists. Yeah. I think that what we're talking about when we talk about Comte and its early kind of in an early stage of the description of what we're referring to as altruism, that's a very historically conditioned moment. But to a certain extent, what all these people are talking about when they're talking about virtue altruism is a type of behavior that social groups of human beings tend to work out for themselves. So I think there is a realist aspect to this, but there's also a constructed aspect to it, which I know you're not going to like. Sorry.